We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
This is Booked on Rock, the podcast for those about to read and rock. Subscribe and give the podcast a 5-star review wherever you listen. Website bookedonrock.com. Peter Gallagher is back on the podcast. Last time we had him on to talk about his book, Warren Zevon, Every Album, Every Song. This time he's here to talk about his latest book, Kiss in the 1970s. Peter takes us on a journey through Kiss's most eventful decade. In the early days, Kiss was just about done. Poor album reviews. Some merited due to poor production, some I think undeserved. With the record company against the wall and their manager's money drained, Kiss seemed destined to become one of the lost bands of the 70s. But by the end of the decade, they were the biggest band in the world, or as they became famously known, the hottest band in the world. The music, the costumes, the concerts, the merchandise, the comic books, the TV appearances, and the so bad it's good 78 film, Kiss meets the Phantom of the Park. Peter is here to tell us all about it. This is part 1 of a 2-part interview with Peter. Part 2, we rank all 14 albums during the Kiss 70s era. That includes the studio albums, the live albums, and the 4 solo albums. You can listen to a playlist of Kiss in the 70s over at the show notes page. But first, here is part 1 of my interview with Peter Gallagher. Hi, Peter. Welcome back to the podcast. Good to see you again.
Hi, Eric. Glad to be back. I'm happy to be here to talk about my new Kiss book.
How big was Kiss in Scotland back? Were you living in Scotland in the 70s?
Yep. Glasgow born and bred.
How big were they in that area at that time?
Not at all. Not big in the slightest. I was, as far as I'm aware, I was the only guy in my school that liked Kiss and took a regular slagging because of it. All sorts of jokes about how they couldn't play their instruments and all that kind of stuff. So, no, Kiss were really frowned upon. They weren't seen as having the musicality of a Deep Purple or a Led Zeppelin, which was what a lot of my peers were into. As indeed was I. I happen to like Kiss as well. But no, and chart-wise, Kiss did nothing here in the UK, really. They appeared... They did the one and only tour in the UK in the 70s in 76, early 76, and that helped boost Destroyer into the album charts. But even then, it was only at number 22. I think the next time they troubled the charts was something like when Dynasty came out in 79, and we're talking like maybe number 50 or something like that. So Kiss actually became bigger in Britain when the makeup came off. So in their lean US years, they were actually bigger here.
Right, that was the Crazy Nights album was huge there.
The Crazy Nights was a big hit here. And
in 87.
The Crazy Nights was a big hit here. But even things like the Lick It Up album, I think it was a top 20, their first top 20 album, I think. So it's weird, the original lineup and the makeup lineup really weren't successful. But the sort of hairband 80s version, they were successful.
Well, your book focuses on the 70s, so let's get to that. And the band's emergence in the 70s, it's such a great story. It's an inspiring story, really, for any band who's thinking about giving up. It's never over till it's over. You set up the formation of Kiss to start out the book. You introduce us to the 4 members of the band: Paul Stanley, formerly Stanley Eisen; Gene Simmons, formerly, I believe it's pronounced Haimwitz. I think I got that right, yeah. Ace Frehley, formerly Paul Frehley, and Peter Criss, formerly George Peter John Criscuola. On January 3rd, 1973, or as you write sometime late December, depending on who you talk to, Paul and Gene are looking for a guitarist to complete the lineup after bringing in Peter, and Ace responds to an ad in the Village Voice from a band looking for a guitarist. He arrives at his audition. This is the famous story. It's on 10 East 23rd Street, New York City, above the Live Bait Bar. He shows up with one orange sneaker, one red sneaker, gets the gig. They settle on the name Kiss soon after. And that's after hearing Peter being in a previous band called Lips. Paul comes up with Kiss, and everybody agrees. But what wasn't so quickly settled on was the band's look. This took some time to develop into what we now know as that legendary look of the 4 characters, or the 4 original members. At first, they go with that androgynous look, which was inspired by the New York Dolls, but quickly they switched to the black leather look with the silver highlights. So what leads to the characters and the makeup designs, which you mentioned Alice Cooper, he plays a role in this. What leads to these characters? In fact, it wasn't Paul, he had a Zorro look at one time?
Yep. But before we even get to the look, they were very clear about one aspect of the look that has nothing to do with makeup is that they had no single lead singer. So from day one, they wanted to go for the sort of Beatles model, where you could have a Paul or a John or a George or even occasionally a Ringo doing the lead vocals. So there was no one focal point within the band. So that was there before even before the androgyny of trying to copy the New York Dolls happened. But then the second influence would be the time. We are in the glam rock era. You've got T-Rex, you've got David Bowie, you've got Slade, you've got Roxy Music, you've got all these innovators. And the only real stateside entry would be Alice Cooper. So they knew they wanted to not have a single frontman, and they knew they wanted to fit into the glam rock molds. And the final influence we can throw into the pot is Alice Cooper. The 4 band members attended a Cooper concert and came away with the idea of they liked what they saw on stage. They liked the fact that Cooper had created a character very individual to him, this sinister vaudevillian villain character. And of course, Cooper had distinctive eye makeup. And the 4 of them came away with the idea of that was brilliant. Why don't we try to do a band that's got 4 Alice Cooper style characters? So once they hit upon that, I think that's when we see the black eye makeup come into place. So Simmons, he combines his love of monster movies with his love of Marvel comics to come up with the Demon, as he called it in some interviews, a cross between Godzilla and the Marvel comic character Black Bolt. I can only assume that's because that character's got sort of bat wings. Chris went for a cat design. As far as he was concerned, cats were tough and had an independent spirit, and he liked to see himself in precisely those terms. Stanley adopted the star because it was a symbol of his aspirations. It's what he wanted to be. And Fraley was already, in the interview, I believe, Fraley was already, or the audition rather, Fraley was already telling anyone willing to listen that he came from another planet. So he became the band's resident alien. Once they get the idea of individual characters, still had a bit of developing to go, but they were recognisable as the characters we know today from that point on. The only major change, as you mentioned, was Paul Stanley. He went for the single star and then adopted a Zorro or a raccoon look or a bandit mask look. And this was basically down to Neil Bogart, the president of Casablanca Records, Kiss's record label. And he was concerned that Stanley, not just his makeup design, but also how he acted on stage was too effeminate. And it could alienate the hard rock audience that he was wanting to hopefully buy Kiss records. On the other hand, you can almost see Neil Bogart's problem. The New York Dolls, that androgyny look, they had great songs, but if we're being truthful, they really went nowhere. I mean, I love the Dolls. I've got all their albums they released when they reformed this century. But they're a cult band, and they've never been anything more than a cult band. And similarly, over in the States, you had a huge hype in 1973, the year prior to Kiss. You had Jobriath being launched. I don't know if you remember Jobriath, but he was basically he was essentially, he was actually a skilled musician, but at the time he was essentially a David Bowie copycat. But the big difference he was openly gay, high camp gay, and there was a huge hype and huge spectacle. Worth looking up his story. Ultimately, it's a sad story.
How do you spell that name, Peter? Jobriath?
Jobriath. So
here he is. I see it here. Oh, yeah, he did have the feminine look.
If you were driving around New York or LA back in 1973, you would have seen him in huge billboards all over town. But he was openly gay, and his career ended basically there and then. And I think it basically there was a homophobic attitude towards him that probably ended his career. So it was perhaps with that in mind that Neil Bogart, he felt the red lipstick was too effeminate. Maybe the star was too effeminate. Could you stop that? And being a team player, Stanley initially did. And then he realised that the Bandit or Zorro makeup did nothing for him. The star, as far as he was concerned, was his character.
Yeah, well, it was the right move to go back to the star for sure. And the band made their live debut on Tuesday night, January 30th, 1973, at the Coventry Hotel in Queens. Paul later said they played to an audience of less than 10, but things would soon change thanks to Bill Aucoin. He discovers the band, gets them a record deal with Casablanca, the now iconic stage show we still see Kiss performing today. How does that all begin? You write in the book about what Aucoin and his boyfriend Sean Delaney did to improve the band's stagecraft, most notably with Gene.
Well, surprisingly, actually, much of the stage show is there from the beginning. Admittedly, on a very limited budget, of course, nothing like what we see today or even what would have been seen by 1976, but the focus was there from day one, so they tried to get as much of the stage show there also. So, for example, the first obvious visual element is the makeup and costumes. So that's there. But they also have, you mentioned Sean Delaney. Peter Criss credits him as being the fifth member of the band. He comes in, he acts essentially, not sure what title we'll give him or what title I give him in the book, but creative consultant or maybe director. He'll come into the band's rehearsals. He will film them as rehearse. He will play the film back, and then they'll discuss what they did right and what they did wrong, what to build on and what to watch out for. One day in rehearsal, Paul Stanley has an itch in his head, so he scratches it. And Sean Delaney says, "Don't do that on stage, it doesn't look good." Paul Stanley says, "But I had an itch." Sean Delaney said, "Right, fine, so kid on, you're just sort of puffing your hair up, turn it into a move." You'll still see him do that move, though.
Yeah, with the hair.
Yeah, several times per gig. So that came from Delaney. You would also have moves that are still there today, like when there's a section when they play Juice, when the three guitars sway at the same time, they sort of rock
Classic.
back and forward at the same time. That Delaney, not saying the band didn't have input, but this was all Delaney. The finale of Black Diamond with Ace or Tommy lying on his back, while Gene and Paul stand over him swaying. You know, all these, even the changing of microphones and things like that, going from left to right, there's something they sort of do less now, I notice, but lots of this stuff was there in the early days, and lots of this stuff came from working with Sean Delaney. Bill Aucoin, one of his lasting legacies, apart from Kiss's survival, is the iconic Kiss sign. Makes its debut in the New Year's Eve gig of 1973 when they play the New York Academy of Music. When they're fourth in the bill, they weren't even advertised on the bill. They're a last-minute replacement. You've got Teenage Lust, then again the Stooges, then Blue Oyster Cult. And these three bands come on to see this massive battery of lights saying the name Kiss, which must have cost a bit of money for a band that hasn't even released an album or a single at this point. But the vision is there, the conviction that they will succeed and this is a worthwhile investment is there. So you have this sign acting as a brand, acting as an identity and a presence on stage. And that must have made the headliners a wee bit envious. And Neil Bogart, we mentioned him already in terms of trying to interfere with Paul Stanley's makeup design. But it was him that came up with the levitating drum kit, for example. Levitating is maybe too magical a word to roadies using a pulley to pull it up originally, and not always evenly, so it could be good up like that. And poor old Peter's getting shunted left to right.
Peter, real quick, didn't Ace come up with the design for the logo?
He designed the logo. So Paul always says, and even Ace says, that he modified it. Paul modified Ace's design. I don't know if the lines were quite parallel in the S's or what have you. I'm not entirely sure what Paul did, but it is accepted that he modified the logo. Neil Bogart introduced the fire breathing. Again, you've got to give Kiss some credit. You know, you've got Peter getting pulled up by roadies on this so-called levitating drum riser. and getting rocked left to right. And then you've got night one of doing the fire breathing. Gene sets his hair alight, but they both carry on, So give them credit for being troopers back in the day. One thing it didn't last, the fire breathing's still here today. Simmons has set his hair on fire many times since. But one thing it didn't last is Simmons also used these things called flashballs, which are like small paper parcels. And the idea of magicians use them apparently. And the idea is he would throw them out above the audience head and they would explode spectacularly but harmlessly when he did that, and it would be above their heads. But more or less the first time he tried it, he hit a fan that was standing on a chair at the New York Academy of Music, and it exploded in his face. And going by both Simmons and Stanley's descriptions, which I give in the book, clearly the guy was seriously burnt. Nowadays, incredibly no legal action was forthcoming back then, but nowadays it's the sort of incident that could have been a career killer. But they survived that, so they survived setting band members alight, they survived setting audience members alight, and they survived the levitating drum kit.
And there is video of Gene's hair going up in flames. You've seen that one, right? Yeah, it's a quick shot, but you see it clearly. And then the roadie comes out and he's got the towel and he's putting it out. Dangerous times.
First time around at the Academy show, it was Sean Delaney who had the quick thinking to come out with a wet towel and wrap his head in a wet towel.
Well, let's get to the first two albums. They release both in 1 year, 1974. The self-titled debut in February, followed by Hotter Than Hell in October. Hotter Than Hell has been criticized for its production, which I can't argue with that, but that 74 debut is a classic. Strutter, Nothing to Lose, Firehouse, Cold Gin, Deuce, 100,000 Years, and Black Diamond, all on this album. No hit single, poor sales, only reaches number 87 on the charts when it was released. To me, it's a classic. What do you think of that debut album?
Yeah, the word classic applies. The fact that we are 50 years later, Kiss are still touring, they're on their end of the road tour, and nearly half the tracks from that first album still appear in the current show. Again, I can't think of many bands, in fact, never mind 50 years, I can't think of many bands that would be playing 4 tracks from their debut album 10 or 20 years into the career, let alone 50 years into the career. So those songs stand the test of time, definitely. And even the less glamour tracks, I actually like the cover of Kissin' Time. I think.
Do you? Okay, yeah, because that's the one that's much maligned by fans. That's not the maligned,
and I know they didn't like, the band didn't like it. They only did it in the understanding it wouldn't appear on the album and it wouldn't be released as a single. And of course, both things happened. But no, I like it. I even like we can only call it goofiness, Love Theme from Kiss.
Yeah, that's what I hear people say they don't like. I love Love Theme from Kiss. That's the instrumental. I love that.
Yeah, absolutely fine. I mean, they're not as musically accomplished as the likes of Isaac Hayes, but you can see they're doing they're attempting some sort of soul funk thing going on there. And that's actually one of the things I really like about the first album. Is probably a lot more adventurous than anything until we get to Destroyer. So we do have an instrumental, for example. One thing I really dislike about Kiss is lyrically, I think they're terrible. They've only got 2 songs, I Want to Have Sex With You or You Want to Have Sex With Me, basically. But in this first album, we've got songs like, Cold Gin, admittedly it's just about drinking, but we've got 100,000 Years, we've got Black Diamond, which has some borderline social commentary on it. So they're lyrically far more adventurous in this album, and they're willing to throw in something like Love Theme from Kiss. So no, strong songs, a greater sense of adventure than they're going to have for quite a wee while. I think the debut album it's excellent. The only track I don't like, and I know it's a favourite with many, is Firehouse. It's got a riff, but I don't think the riff ever quite becomes a song. So if I skip anything on the Kiss debut album, it's going to be Firehouse, whereas I'll let Kissin' Time and Love Theme from Kiss play quite happily. But no, we'll see where it is in my top 14 a wee bit later on.
We're going to get to that.
But one thing I can tell you now is I'm one of the people that would share that would also give Hotter Than Hell a bad rap. I'm not a fan. And as the years go on, I become less of a fan of that album. Two big reasons I don't like it. Number one, you've got Richie Wise, you've got Kerry Kerner. Both of them were involved with a band called Dust, which also had Mark Bell, later Marky Ramone, as their drummer. I mean, Dust released two very, very heavy albums. So you think Richie Wise, the guitarist, songwriter, Kerry Kerner, the producer and lyric writer for Dust, might be able to bring across a hard rocking sound for Kiss, but somehow they fail. We're going to blame Wise and Kerner for part of the sound. Another thing, though, I don't say it in the book, but since crossed my mind since then, is it's possible Neil Bogart was influencing them. I mean, he does come from a pop bubblegum background, so even though he wants a hard rock group, maybe he thought something like Dust sounded too dense and too uncommercial. I don't know, but it is a possibility, because it just seems so strange that Wise and Kerner can come from Dust, one of the heaviest early 70s bands, and then produce what they did for Kiss.
It just has a tinny sound to it. The drums, when I first got it, somebody burned it onto a CD, and I listened to it, and I thought they burned it on a super low bit rate, which, if for those who may not be familiar, if you have an MP3 with a low bit rate, it sounds really tinny and thin. And so I bought the actual copy that the band sells officially.
And it sounded the same.
It sounded exactly the same.
Because you think the person that would benefit most from Wise and Kerner's light-handed touch would be Peter Criss on the drums, and would get more of his jazz and his swing influence coming across. But no, you don't get any of them coming out particularly well. Even in the first album, actually, the one thing that I thought Wise and Kerner really did well on the first album was bring out Gene's bass sound. You know, if you listen to later Kiss albums, including even Hotter Than Hell, I'm never sure how good a bass player Gene Simmons is, because his bass is always too buried. But you can actually hear it to the fore. For, in my opinion, one of the
solid
few
bass
times
player
on that first album. So you actually get a sense of how good a player he is. I also need to say about Hotter Than Hell is it suffers from sophomore album syndrome. You know, the idea you've got your whole life to write your first album, but 6 months to write your second one. It definitely is there. I know some of the songs are leftovers
from Wicked Lester.
Yeah,
you said?
I can't remember what. Yeah.
Parasite to me, though, is top tier Kiss to me. Parasite's a great song. That's Ace right there. He's all over that one.
Yeah, and it's also quite forward looking. We've got a real sort of stoner rock or grunge sort of thing going on long before it actually became a genre. There are good songs on it. I particularly like Strange Ways, I think, is a good song.
Yep.
Again, an Ace Frehley song. I like Paul Stanley's Mainline, but on the whole, I do think Hotter Than Hell is a very weak album.
We're talking with Peter Gallagher, author of Kiss in the 1970s. It is out now through Sonic Bond. And Kiss comes right back with Dressed to Kill in 1975. It includes Kiss classics Rock Bottom, Come On and Love Me, She, Love Her All I Can, and another song that would go on to become one of the greatest anthems in rock history, Rock and Roll All Night. What's the story behind the song? How was it created?
Rock and Roll All Night is a concerted effort to score a hit single. Essentially, Neil Bogart comes to the band and says, why don't you come up with a band anthem, something along the lines of Sly and the Family Stones Dance to the Music. I don't know if Kiss are quite musically sophisticated enough to match Sly and the Family Stone, but they rise to the challenge, they take the idea on board, they go away and work on it, and essentially they create the song by grafting two fragments together, a fragment that Paul Stanley's got and a fragment that Gene Simmons has got, and that's Rock and Roll All Night. One thing I like that Gene Simmons does is he acknowledges more Slade's influence rather than Sly Stone's influence. I'd never thought of it till I read that particular interview, but yeah, I can see Rock and Roll All Night being definitely in the same vein as the glam rock classics that Slade came out with. I don't know how big Slade were over
here
in the States. So you're aware
Slade,
of
well, Slade had one major hit here in the States, and that was boy, now I'm drawing a blank. Run Away.
Oh, that's the
Run Away. That was a big hit.
Run Away, yeah.
1983, I want to say.
Yeah.
Yeah, not as big as they should have been. In fact, Noddy Holder, there was talk he would take over Bon Scott's role as singer of AC/DC at one point. And I think they asked him, and he said no. He said, "This Slade's my band."
Yeah, I've heard that.
But yeah, it is a good point, though. Gene's right about that. I could see Slade singing Rock and Roll Night, definitely.
Yeah. And if you go back and listen to their songs like Come On, Feel the Noise,
oh yeah,
Squeeze Me, Please Me, and things like
Come On, Feel the Noise, we thought that was Quiet Riot's song, that they wrote it. And then eventually we find out it's a cover of a Slade. And then Quiet Riot covered another Slade song, which was Mama, We're All Crazy Now, was a Slade song.
Yeah. I think both of those songs you mentioned were both UK #1 singles. I think they had something like 6 #1 singles in a 2-3 year period. They were absolutely massive in the early 70s in the UK. Anyway, they were also a big influence in Gene Simmons in particular, and Paul Stanley to an extent, and Rock and Roll All Night kind of is the same DNA as the Slade songs. He did mention it's their first success, but it's a limited success. It only gets to number 68. They'll need to wait for the live version before they see some true chart action with Rock and Roll All Night.
Which is interesting. So let's get to that live album, Kiss Alive, released in September of 1975. To remind listeners just how important this album is, where's the band at this point before the album is released? Because they're almost down for the 10 count at this point, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, when I was researching this book, I came across an article titled something along the lines of How Kiss Alive Changed the Recording Industry. And I also came across several more that kind of implied that. But one thing worth mentioning, I think, is that's a complete myth. Kiss Alive did not change the recording industry. The idea being it led to live albums like Frampton Comes Alive and so on. But you had a whole bunch of bands doing live albums already. You had Yes songs by Yes, you had Made in Japan, Deep Purple, Live at Leeds The Who, Uriah Heep Live and so on. Alive is hugely important in the Kiss story. Where were they at that point? Well, basically they were on the ropes. Casablanca were facing bankruptcy and a whole bunch of debt collectors. The band had not received a penny from Casablanca. They've got 3 albums out and they haven't received any royalties. The only person that's keeping Kiss going is Bill Aucoin, and he's facing for real financial straits as well. So I think it's safe to say, in fact, because of the royalty situation, Aucoin and Kiss were pretty pissed off at Casablanca. So Aucoin had started to try shop Kiss around to other record labels. But by that time, 1975, they were basically seen as an unsuccessful past or sell-by date glitter band. So it's highly possible if Alive didn't happen, Kiss would have folded and would just be a footnote. What happened though is, being aware that Aucoin was shipping Kiss all around, and I don't know if it was through desperation or prescience, but Bogart was still convinced that Alive would put them on the map, so he actually paid Aucoin and the 4 guys from Kiss $2 million, saying, "Stay with us, let's see what happens with Alive." And fortunately for him, his gamble paid off, and Alive ultimately went to number 9 in the charts, and it hung around for about 2 years. So Kiss and Casablanca and Bill Aucoin were basically all financially saved. So it's a game changer for Kiss, it's a game changer for Casablanca. More so for Kiss, it has to be said. So the same year, Casablanca have a big hit with one of Donna Summer's albums, and they have a big hit with a Parliament or a Funkadelic album, so they might survive. Kiss almost certainly won't survive unless Alive does the business, and it did the business.
So what was it, right place, right time for Kiss? I know the stories, we've all heard them now, that it's not really live. I mean, much of it was touched up after and re-recorded and all that, but still, it captured the live Kiss energy in a way that the studio albums couldn't.
I think you're absolutely right. It does capture the energy. Yes, it's overdubbed, very much overdubbed, but the energy is there of a live Kiss concert, and that's a big plus. And I think the energy there is largely down to they finally got a good producer in the shape of Eddie Kramer. Eddie Kramer did all their early demos, so why they didn't hook up with him in the beginning, who knows?
Worked with Hendrix.
Yeah, that's right. Eddie Kramer, I think, is a fundamental element to capturing that live Kiss energy. There's other contributing factors, as I've just listed, for me, a whole bunch of artists that released that live albums just around about this time. The live albums in vogue for some reason in the 70s. There have been live albums before the 70s, but live rock albums became a big thing in the 70s. So it doesn't hurt for Kiss that it's an in vogue thing. Number two is Kiss are a live attraction. They're doing well out on the touring circuit. They've got a real vocal set of fans when they're out on the road, some of whom have already vocally shown their displeasure for the production in the first three albums. So the fan base is growing for the live Kiss, even if it's not growing for the recorded Kiss. So that fan base, when they saw Kiss Alive, will presumably have bought the album, assuming, as we did back at the time, that it was actually all live. So their growing fan base is a live act with a help there. So the live album being in vogue, growing fan base, but definitely Eddie Kramer, I think, are all the contributing factors there. So right moment, right time because of the Vogue thing, and it captures the live Kiss energy, which would satisfy the fan base. And it doesn't hurt that they actually finally have a hit single. Rock and Roll All Night. Oh, I can't remember what number it got to. I think maybe 12.
I think you're right. Yeah, the live version. The Booked on Rock podcast will return after this. A lot is written and talked about regarding that live album and its importance, but if Kiss doesn't follow up with a hit studio album, maybe Kiss falls off the radar, but we know that isn't the case with 1976's Destroyer, Detroit Rock City, God of Thunder, Flaming Youth, Shout It Out Loud, Do You Love Me, and the song that saved the album, Beth. Can you talk about Bob Ezrin's importance here, what led them to choosing him as producer, and what are some of the things he did with the band that, although it drove Peter and Ace nuts, really paid off in the end?
Well, Ezrin came via Bill Aucoin. It was Bill Aucoin that suggested they go with Ezrin for Destroyer. What he brought was basically what Kiss had been missing on their studio albums to date. So he brings a polish, he brings a sheen, he brings a big sound that's been missing from all the previous albums. I think you could now compare Kiss, Destroyer, that is, with, for example, David Bowie's albums that were produced by himself and Ken Scott, or the T-Rex albums produced by Tony Visconti, or indeed the Alice Cooper albums produced by Bob Ezrin. So we've got this fantastic, big, shiny sound. And that's the kind of sound Kiss really should have had from day one. And it's interesting that for all the talk of Kiss every so often saying, oh, we're going to go back to the basics. I mean, they did it the first time they did it was probably with Rock and Roll Over. They never actually go back to the rawness of the first three albums. They always keep that polish and that shine that they first had. You know, it might not be the big production number of Bob Ezrin, but they definitely keep the shine and the polish that he brought to Destroyer. Things Ezrin did for the band, the most obvious oral embellishments were to bring in things like an orchestra and choir, unthinkable. But probably his biggest contribution was to teach the band members music 101, music fundamentals. No member of Kiss has had formal music training. No member of Kiss, it turns out, actually knows how to correctly tune their instruments. And Ezrin essentially puts them through boot camp, I think is what Paul Stanley describes it as, summer boot camp, music boot camp. And some people respond to that well, and some people don't respond to it well. So Stanley and Simmons respond to it well. Freely and Chris do not. Ace in particular have this close enough for rock and roll mentality. You'll tune the guitar so far, but that will do. It's close enough for rock and roll. Whereas Ezrin's a bit of a perfectionist. He wants everything to be right, and he wants everything to be played again and again till it is right. And that doesn't sit well with Peter or Ace. Got to give some credit to Chris here. He stays the course for a guy that has a bit of a habit of saying he'll quit and for storming off. He stays the course, and he does produce, I think, the best drumming of his career. So he's obviously taking on board what Ezrin is telling him, teaching him. Why he doesn't retain that knowledge for later albums, I'm not entirely sure, but he does take it on board for Destroyer. And finally, we get to hear the guy behind the drum kit, which, you had to really listen out for in the first 3 albums. But now with the drumming and the opening track, Detroit Rock City, I mean, those drums are a presence all the way through the song. It actually sounds like it's someone else drumming. It isn't. It's just Chris has taken on board what Ezrin has been teaching him. So even at an individual level, and that's a good enough example. We've got Ezrin as a teacher, and we've got the band benefiting, and I think we've got us as the listener benefiting as well from what Ezrin brings to the table. Love that flamenco solo in Detroit Rock City, but it wasn't written by Frehley and it wasn't written by Stanley, so one of the most distinctive parts of the song was written by Bob Ezrin and then taught to Stanley and then taught to Frehley. So essentially, I don't understand why Wise and Kerner couldn't have done it, but what we have with Bob Ezrin is we've got real musicality being brought to Kiss for the first time. With the exception of Frehley, I think the other 3 members kind of step up. 2 of them will learn from it, 3 of them will learn from it, but 1 of them will bitch about it forevermore thereafter. But I think musicality and great production is what Ezrin brings to the table. And another thing that he brings, and it's something kind of important to me, I really struggle with Kiss and their limited approach to lyrics, and Ezrin actually said, get rid of your fuck me, suck me lyric writing and bring something new to the table. So we've got the death rock of Detroit Rock City, we've got almost tenderness that's in Great Expectations, or a plaintiveness that's in Beth, and so on. Things that you didn't get in previous Kiss albums.
And we should also give a shout out and props to Ken Kelly, who sadly we just lost. He does the iconic artwork for the cover of Kiss Destroyer. And sadly, we've lost quite a few important names in Kiss history, or Kistery as they call it. We should mention too, Sean Delaney, no longer with us. Yep. Bill Aucoin, he since passed too. But Ken Kelly does the artwork for that Destroyer album, and it is just iconic. And the year 1976 is another 2 studio album year for Kiss. Destroyer was released in March of 76. In November of that year, they released Rock and Roll Over. Instead of a repeat of Destroyer with a heavily produced album featuring added theatrical effects and orchestral arrangements, they go back to the rock roots with Eddie Kramer back behind the boards. I Want You, Calling Dr. Love, Love 'Em and Leave 'Em, Mr. Speed, Hard Luck Woman, and Making Love. Again, all Kiss classics. As successful of an album Destroyer was, many pick this album as the best. Is it worthy of that praise?
Well, yeah, I have a real fondness for Rock and Roll Over, definitely. But I don't know that it's their best. I do think it's a very strong album, but we'll keep you in suspense until we get to our shared ranking later on.
Yeah, we're going to rank all 14, including the live albums and the 4 solo albums, by the way. So we came up with a list of 14. Love Gun, studio album number 6, released in late June 1977. I always say it's a perfect Kiss album, if not for the last track. The cover of 1963's Then She Kissed Me by the Crystals. But you've got I Stole Your Love, Christine 16, Got Love for Sale, Shock Me, featuring Ace's first lead vocal performance, Tomorrow and Tonight, the title track, of course. Hooligans on there, Almost Human, Plaster Caster. Eddie Kramer produces this album as well. Is this the last great Kiss album?
That's maybe a question for the wider range of Kiss fans, because it depends when you came to Kiss. So there'll be people out there, for example, that will really rate Creatures of the Night. I'd stop listening to Kiss by then. Or there'll be people that rate Revenge or Lick It Up or what have you.
Yep.
What we can say about Love Gun, which we know with hindsight, is Love Gun was probably, I wouldn't say the last Kiss album proper, but it's the last original lineup Kiss album proper. For that, it's of some historical importance.
It's followed by a Live 2 released in October of 77, which has some studio tracks on there where you don't have all 4 original members. This is when I really became a Kiss fan, around the time of Alive 2 or shortly after, because I saw that cover with Gene and the blood on it. I had a friend of mine give me the album, and this may have been, I don't know, around 1979, 1980, so a couple of years after it came out, but it just blew me away. This is another commercial success, and by this time, Kiss is everywhere. The Kiss Army is getting bigger and bigger. Merchandising is everywhere. Lunchboxes, T-shirts. They have their own Marvel comic book. You got the Kiss dolls to come soon. That was in 78. Here's where we get to the part of the Kiss in the 70s story where the wheels start to come off the bus here. The 4 members, they released solo albums in 1978. This was an attempt to keep the band together. And it's really Ace and Peter who are really unhappy with being in the band by this time. Why are they unhappy?
We can say they were unhappy for 3 reasons. Number 1, ego, immaturity, and addiction. Chris and Frehley are both entertaining notions of this fabulous solo career each. But you've got to, even as a Kiss fan, you've got to accept they're kind of bordering on being delusional. You know, with Shock Me, for example, Frehley has finally contributed another song to the Kiss canon, and he even finally sings the lead. But he has been missing in action as a creative force since Dressed to Kill. He has 1 co-write on Destroyer along with another 3 writers. He's got nothing in Rock and Roll Over. You know, he's not really bringing much to the party. So for him to think he's going to go off and make some solo album, some great solo album, at this stage, there's a sense of delusion, I think. We know what he did the following year, of course, but at this point, you can scarce credit his thinking. And Chris is probably worse. He's dredging up all these songs from the early 70s that he did with Chelsea or Lips or whatever bands he was in at the time. Most of them were all of them were co-written with Stan Penridge. There seems to be a strong argument to suggest that Stan Penridge was the driving force in writing the songs. So basically, Chris seems incapable of coming up with songs that are contemporaneous to the actual albums they appear on. And his ego is in overdrive. He's allowed 1 song per album, and all those songs are based on old work. But because he's written Beth, because that's been the band's biggest hit, because it's won a People's Choice award, he thinks the world is for his taking. He doesn't seem to remember Stan Penridge's contributions, and he certainly doesn't seem to remember how much Bob Ezrin brought to Beth in terms of the orchestration and the lushness or saccharine element, depending on your point of view. He just sees him as the writer of Beth, and if he wrote 1 Beth, he can write 1 million and go out and sell a whole bunch of records. So we've got the ego thing there. But, as I say, their contributions are considerably less than Stanley and Simmons, but their egos are in overdrive. They're fueled by alcoholism and Frehley's part. They're fueled by cocaine and Chrissy's part. And there's also growing resentment. They're both now wary of Simmons and Stanley. Simmons is famously teetotal, never taken drugs. Stanley hasn't taken drugs. If he drinks at all, it's to moderation. So for some reason, Chris and Frehley that's not rock and roll, so they're suspicious of that. And they start seeing them as controlling. Whereas I think, regardless of what camp you're in, you need to come down the side of Simmons and Stanley. It's not controlling, they've just got a greater sense of commitment. To such a degree that rather than rock the boat, or, if you're being cynical, upsetting their cash cow, Simmons and Stanley actually encourage Chris and Frehley to do solo albums, but to do so while staying in the band. And then they basically say, but tell you what, guys, we'll do a solo album as well. We'll all go away, take a year off, work on a solo album, rest from each other, and when we come back, we'll be bigger and better. So it goes from one person wanting a solo album to two people wanting a solo album to all four going to release a solo album purely because they think that's what it will take to keep Fraley and Chris happy.
And it didn't work, as we know. And before we get to those solo albums, we got to talk about Kiss Meets the Phantom of the Park, because this is up there with the Star Wars Holiday Special from '78. I don't know if you've seen this one, but it's the first 10 minutes of that movie. There's no dialogue. You just hear the Wookiees making sounds. Okay. I mean, it's that comical. And this is really the same thing. I mean, it's so bad, it's good. I mean, it's just fun to watch because of that. But there actually is a Star Wars connection. I mentioned Star Wars. That's really the idea here, right? For the band to make this film, or was it O'Coin's idea? Whose idea was it?
Ultimately, it was originated with Bill O'Coin. That's now his ego in overdrive. There's a lot of ego going on in Kiss at this point now that they've had success. So as far as he's concerned, his charges have conquered the music industry, as he saw it. They've been the stars of Marvel Comics, biggest selling comic book ever, and it's now to move on and conquer the movie world. And it's sold to Kiss, the members of Kiss, as being in the vein of Star Wars, an action-adventure film, fantasy film in the vein of Star Wars, which of course we know it isn't. And they buy into it, but it has to be said, I mean, no one reads the scripts. Even Gene, who is by now has claimed in many an interview that he wants to be a movie star and has his own degree of work ethic and commitment, he hasn't even read the script, and they're just going on set and they're being fed a line, and if they don't fluff the line, it's a keeper. And there's no getting away from the fact that no one in Kiss can act. I mean, even when Gene goes off into his solo movie career, there's not a heck of a lot of acting going on there. It's basically Gene Simmons playing Gene Simmons. Yeah. It's the same guy you see in interviews, same facial expression, same voice. There's absolutely no acting involved. However, I need to disagree with you, Eric. You said it's so bad it's good. No,
it's so bad it's
just bad. It's just bad. It's unwatchable.
Even with a few drinks in you, it might be a little...
I've attempted it a few times over the years, and the only reason I made it to the end this time is because I had to write about it.
Oh man.
So no, it's truly awful.
You got Peter's dialogue replaced with somebody who's clearly not Peter, and then the classic is the African American guy as Ace's stunt double. I mean, what is your moment in the film that really just stands out as just the most comically bad?
Well, you've just identified it.
I've just covered them.
But there you go. If you've got
not Gene's growl,
bad though that is.
Or Ace's, what was Ace's squawk?
Yeah, I've got two things. Number one is, if one of your standout points of the film is the fact you can spot an African American extra filling in for Ace, then you've got a real film that sucks on your hands. Man.
Yeah, you couldn't find anybody else on the set. I mean, there's
the scene when they're all at the pool and Paul eavesdrops on someone using his eye.
Oh, classic.
Absolutely, because your eye is exactly what you would use to listen to someone.
Oh my God. I mean, it really, it is just, it's on YouTube. Anybody can see it.
But to save yourself from mental illness, don't go near it.
Yeah. Needless to say, there were no Academy Awards presented on that one. Those four solo albums, Aces did the best thanks to the hit single, the cover of Russ Ballard's New York Groove. Number 13 single. What is your favorite of the four?
That's easy. It's Aces. I bought that. That was the one. I could only afford to buy one on the day of the release, and that was the one I went for. And for all I was saying a minute ago, he's got a cheek to, want to go make a solo album because he's not exactly been pulling his weight with Kiss. He delivers. It's just a classic album. It's still, I play it more than any of the other solo albums still today, far more. So yeah, far and away, it's got to be that.
Yep. Yeah, but unfortunately, those solo albums, that idea doesn't pan out. It doesn't resolve the issues within the band. And then on the next studio album, 1979's Dynasty, we have Anton Fig, who would later work in the David Letterman Band, performing on drums on all the tracks but one, Dirty Livin', which Peter also sings on. But Peter's skills not up to par, and producer Vinnie Poncia, who actually, it's funny because Peter wanted him to produce the album. He really pushed hard, and they said, okay, we'll have him come in and produce. He's the one who replaces Peter on drums. This album elicits an interesting response from Kiss fans because some will detest it for being too poppy. I Was Made for Loving You, huge hit, but it's flat out disco, along with Sure Knows Something, both sung by Paul. But it includes Ace's 2000 Man, which is the cover of the Stones song, Hard Times and Save Your Love. He sings those. Peter's Dirty Livin', along with Gene's Charisma and X-Ray Eyes. Paul also takes lead on Magic Touch. Did Kiss alienate their audience on this album, or is it still a worthy record in the 70s Kiss catalog?
I'm not a fan of the 2000 Man cover. It's not bad, don't get me wrong, but I'd much rather have had an Ace original. And I'm not a fan of Peter Criss's writing, so Dirty Livin' does nothing for me. But those two aside, I absolutely do think that Dynasty is a worthy addition to the catalogue. Disco in general, and I Was Made for Loving You in particular, definitely had their naysayers. But number one, they were hardly the first white rock band to attempt a disco track. You had a whole bunch of others doing it beforehand.
Stones, Miss You, Rod Stewart.
That's right.
Do You Think I'm Sexy?
Do You Think I'm Sexy?
Yeah.
Alice Cooper, No More Love at Your Convenience.
Yep.
Lots going on there. And also a band has to develop to survive. Again, if the Beatles had made every album to sound like their first album, would we remember them? But we do remember them because in an 8-year period they produced a dazzling number of albums, and they're all so different from each other. So no, I've got no time, I'm afraid, for the naysayers. You've got to allow a band to experiment. You've got to allow a band to develop. And at the end of the day, by allowing them to develop and experiment, you allow them to survive. Case in point, Dynasty, the album, I Was Made for Loving You, the single, made Kiss brand new fans. I Was Made for Loving You topped the charts in something like 5 countries, was top 5 in another 3 or 4. So it was a huge, huge hit. And probably Kiss were beginning to get into decline, though they didn't realise it at that point. So it probably brought a few new folk on board that would help keep them going into the 80s. So no. And also, bottom line, I think there's some good songs there. You mentioned most of them, but I like I Was Made for Loving You. I like Sure Know Something. It's got a degree of sophistication without being too disco-y, without being too yacht rocky. I think Gene has been slacking prior to the solo album, but now he's back with X-Ray Eyes, Charisma, strong songs. Ace, again, the solo experiment helped. We've got a great song in Save Your Love. So no, there's some really good material there.
Yeah. You do include 1980s Unmasked in the book because really, technically, it is part of that 70s era Kiss. Anton Fig, he's back again on drums, even though, as with Dynasty, Peter's on the cover. Not a hit single to be found here. They released Shandy, Talk to Me, and Tomorrow. And I believe Peter, his very last appearance with the band during that era was in the video for Shandy, I think. I'm going to defend this one. I like the singles, and the 8 songs are great. Talk to Me, Two Sides of the Coin, and Torpedo Girl. They're quirky, but they're fun, and they're all Ace. Too bubblegum for you, or are you a fan of Unmasked?
Nope, I'm definitely a fan. I would actually use the word power pop rather than bubblegum. And you've read the book, so I think you know that I argue the case throughout the book that Kiss were maybe always misidentified by themselves as well as everyone else, because I think they're first and foremost a power pop band. And I think Unmasked is their definitive power pop album. So I love Unmasked. I think it's great. It is one big weakness, but the rest of it I like. You mentioned the Fraley songs. All 3 are excellent. Talk to Me is one of his all-time best. The Simmons songs,
European,
Naked City
She's
is
So
great.
European.
She's So European. Yep, great songs. Paul Stanley, Tomorrow. What an incredible song. Can't believe that wasn't the lead single. Great. And again, great song, but a great power pop song. For me, the only stinker is Shandy. I'm afraid to my ears it's got absolutely no redeemable feature. But again, it did top the chart in Argentina. It went top 10 in Norway and Australia and New Zealand. So what do I know? But I think take Shandy out and Unmasked is a great album. I do not understand why the members of KISS don't like it, and I do not understand why KISS fandom at large don't like it.
Yeah.
Yes, it's the power pop, but no, I love it.
Part 2 of my interview with Peter Gallagher is coming very soon. We rank all 14 albums during the KISS 70s era. Until then, thanks for listening to Booked on Rock.
That's it. It's in the books.